It was 2 weeks to Christmas, and Uncle James's house was full of noise. The children were running up and down the tiled floors, their footsteps echoing through the hallways, excited about their trip to the village, not knowing the kind of evil that was waiting for them. This wasn't their first time, though. Every year, they would travel back home for Christmas, and it was the only time they saw their family in the village. The children loved it because the village was full of fresh air, big trees swaying in the breeze, and cousins to play with under the vast starry sky. Little did they know this year would be different, and in a terrible and tragic way. Uncle James's wife, Aunt Rose, was busy packing clothes neatly into travel bags and cooking snacks for the journey, the scent of freshly baked chin chin filling the kitchen. She always prepared everything days ahead to make sure nothing was forgotten. But there was one thing she always worried about. Uncle James never prayed. "James, please, let us pray for just 2 minutes," she said as she folded clothes into a bag, smoothing out the wrinkles carefully. Uncle James waved his hand like he was chasing a fly. "Rose, stop disturbing me. God knows I am traveling. He doesn't need me to remind him to protect us," he said, laughing and adjusting his wristwatch. Aunt Rose's heart felt heavy. She looked at her husband and shook her head, her fingers tightening around a scarf she was folding. "Why won't you understand?" she whispered to herself. The children were no better. The older ones had started copying their uncle. When Aunt Rose would kneel down in the morning for prayers, they would grumble and drag their feet, saying, "Auntie, why do we have to pray every day? It's boring." Aunt Rose didn't stop praying, even when they made faces at her. She always prayed for her family, asking God to protect them. But deep in her heart, she wished Uncle James would join her, even just once. The house was full of laughter and excitement as the children talked about what they would do in the village. Uncle James smiled at their joy as he sipped his evening tea, but Aunt Rose sat quietly, watching her family. She held her breath and prayed silently, "Lord, keep us safe this Christmas." As the days to Christmas grew closer, the family didn't know that something was waiting for them on the road ahead, something that would test their faith and change their lives forever. One evening, Uncle James was driving home from work, his mind on the journey ahead. The streetlights flickered as he turned the corner, and he saw an old woman standing by the roadside, waving her hand for help. Her wrapper was tied tightly around her waist, and she carried a small basket in her hand, the scent of herbs faintly drifting from it. Uncle James slowed down and stopped beside her. "Mama, where are you going?" he asked, leaning out of the window, his car engine humming softly. "My son," the old woman said, her voice tired and raspy, "I'm going down the next street. Can you take me there?" Uncle James nodded. "Get in, Mama." The old woman climbed into the car, settling herself quietly on the seat. For a while, they drove in silence, the only sound coming from the engine and the faint chirring of crickets outside. Then the old woman cleared her throat. "My son," she began softly, "I hope you won't be angry with what I'm about to say." Uncle James glanced at her. Uncle James glanced at her, curious. "What is it, Mama?" The old woman took a deep breath. "This Christmas, you should not travel to your village. And if you must go, you and your family must pray and fast before the journey. There is danger ahead." Her words hung in the air like smoke, thick and unsettling. Uncle James laughed, a loud, hearty laugh that made the old woman's face tighten. "Mama, You want me to stop my family from going to the village? This is not the first time I've traveled for Christmas. Nothing will happen, he said, shaking his head, gripping the steering wheel. The old woman looked at him, her eyes dark and serious. I've said what I came to say. The rest is up to you, my son. When they reached her destination, Uncle James stopped the car, and the old woman got out. She turned to him one last time, her shadow stretching in the dim streetlight. Thank you for the ride. Remember my words, pray and fast if you must go. Uncle James waved her off, smiling. Thank you, Mama. Take care. As he drove away, he thought to himself, why do people like to scare others with these stories? Why do people like to scare others with these stories? He convinced himself that she was just being superstitious or trying to sound wise. After all, he had made this trip many times before, and nothing had ever happened. But as the car disappeared into the evening, the old woman stood still, watching, her face unreadable. Her words had been spoken, but what lay ahead was no longer in her hands. It was 2 days to Christmas, and the house was buzzing with excitement. Bags were packed and stacked by the door, filled with clothes, gifts, and snacks for the long journey. The children danced around, their laughter filling the air, talking about the village and all the fun they would have with their cousins. Aunt Rose, as always, was the calm one, her eyes filled with quiet worry. Before they left, she called everyone to the living room. Let's pray before we go, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Uncle James frowned, adjusting his car keys in his palm. Rose, what is it with you and prayers? We are not going to the moon. It's just the village. Let me go and warm the car, he said, waving her off. Aunt Rose sighed and knelt to pray alone with the children. She whispered her usual plea to God, protect us, Lord, and guide my family. Outside, Uncle James got into the driver's seat, turned the ignition key, and waited. But instead of the usual hum of the engine, there was silence. He tried again, and the car coughed weakly but refused to start. What is this now? Uncle James muttered, his forehead creased with frustration. He got out, opened the bonnet, and stared at the engine as if it would explain itself. He jiggled a few wires and tried again. Still the car wouldn't start. Frustrated, he went back inside to tell Aunt Rose. The car won't start. I don't know what's wrong with it, he said, scratching his head, his voice laced with irritation. Aunt Rose looked at him, calm as ever. Maybe God doesn't want us to go, she said softly, her hand still resting on her lap. Uncle James snapped. Stop saying that. What does God have to do with a car engine? I'll call the mechanic. The mechanic came quickly, his tools clanging as he inspected the car. After a few minutes, he stood up and shook his head. Oga, the engine has knocked. This car isn't going anywhere until it's fixed. Uncle James's mouth fell open. Knocked? How? I drove this car yesterday, and there was nothing wrong with it. The mechanic shrugged. Sometimes these things just happen, sir. It's beyond me. Aunt Rose smiled faintly. God knows why, she said, her voice steady, her heart quietly thanking the heavens. But Uncle James wouldn't hear it. God knows why, he mimicked sarcastically, rolling his eyes. So now what? Are we just going to stay here and cancel Christmas? Aunt Rose said nothing, only watching as her husband paced the room like a restless lion, his footsteps heavy against the tiled floor. After a while, Uncle James clapped his hands and said, We'll go to the park and take a commercial bus. It's not ideal, but we'll still get to the village. Aunt Rose frowned, smoothing the edge of her wrapper. Maybe we shouldn't go at all, she said gently. Don't start again, Rose, Uncle James snapped, rubbing his temples. I've made up my mind. And with that, the matter was settled. The bags were repacked for the bus, and the children, still excited, prepared for the journey, their laughter ringing through the house. But Aunt Rose's heart was heavy, and she prayed silently, Lord, take control. However, what Uncle James and his family didn't know was that not everyone was happy with the yearly Christmas visits. Far away in the village, the air was quiet, but Mama Amaka's heart was full of noise. She sat outside her mud house, the scent of burning firewood drifting in the air, staring at the dusty road, her face twisted with bitterness. Every year, Uncle James and his family arrived like kings, their shiny car drawing all eyes. His wife, Aunt Rose, and their children looked so well fed and happy. Meanwhile, her 4 sons could barely afford to return home, and when they did, it was on old bicycles or on foot, their clothes dusty from the long journey. Mama Amaka clenched her fist around the edge of her wrapper. Why must every Christmas be about James? She muttered, her voice thick with resentment. Her heart boiled with jealousy, and she made up her mind that this year would be different. She called for her closest friend, Mama E., her voice low and urgent. Sister, she said, her tone sharp as a knife, I cannot take it anymore this year. That boy and his family will not come here to show off their wealth. Mama, whose tongue was sharper than a blade, nodded, her thin lips curling into a sly smile. You are right, Amaka. It's time you did something about it. Without wasting time, Mama Amaka and Mama E went deep into the forest, where the village witches lived. The path was dark, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, with trees bending low like they were listening. The sound of crickets and distant howls filled the night. When they reached the witch's hut, a cold wind blew through, making their skin crawl. The leader of the witches, an old woman with a face as wrinkled as a dry leaf, sat by a fire, her eyes glowing like embers. Why have you come? Her voice echoed like thunder, filling the small hut. Mama Amaka knelt on the ground, her head bowed in reverence. I need your help. My stepson, James, must not reach this village alive. His success has shamed me and my children for too long. The witches laughed, the sound chilling, like the rustling of dead leaves. Is that all? The leader said, her lips twisting into a grin. Consider it done. They gathered around a pot bubbling with thick black liquid, the pungent scent of burning herbs filling the air. One of the witches threw in a piece of cloth. Mama Amaka had brought a piece of James's shirt from his last visit. Another added ashes, muttering words that twisted the air into an eerie hum. The leader raised her hand, and the room went silent. They will not reach this village alive, she declared. A deadly accident awaits them on the road. Mama Amaka's heart swelled with dark joy. She handed over some coins as payment, the metal clinking in the quiet hut, and the witches laughed as they prepared the final curse. It is done, the leader said, her voice cold as stone. Mama Amaka returned home that night, her face calm but her heart dancing. She could already picture it, James's car smashed, his family gone, and the villagers mourning. Finally, there would be no one to overshadow her sons. Back in the city, Early the next morning, Uncle James and his family arrived at the park. The place was busy with travelers, the air filled with the voices of vendors shouting and selling bread, sachet water, and roasted corn. The children clung to their bags, their excitement bubbling as they watched buses being loaded with luggage, the wheels creaking under the weight. Uncle James, holding the tickets tightly, led his family to a bus. It wasn't as comfortable as their car, but it would get them to the village. As they settled into their seats, Aunt Rose's voice broke the chatter. "Please, let us pray before the journey begins," she said, standing up and looking at the passengers, her hands clasped together. Some people nodded and closed their eyes, while others ignored her, whispering among themselves. Uncle James's face turned red with embarrassment. "Rose, sit down," he hissed, his voice low but firm. "You're embarrassing me. This is public transport, not church." But Aunt Rose didn't listen. She closed her eyes, her voice firm and steady. "Lord, protect us on this journey. Cover this bus and everyone inside it. Amen." "Amen," some passengers mumbled, while others rolled their eyes, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Uncle James shook his head, muttering, "She will never change." The bus soon roared to life and took off, the city gradually fading into the distance, replaced by vast open land and scattered trees. The children chatted and laughed, pointing out sights along the road, their voices filled with excitement. Uncle James, feeling the gentle sway of the bus, dozed off, his head resting against the window, the hum of the engine lulling him to sleep. For a while, everything was peaceful. The road stretched ahead, long and endless, and the sound of the tires rolling against the asphalt filled the air. But as they approached the middle of their journey, things changed. Suddenly, the driver's voice cut through the calm. "The brakes, the brakes are not working," he shouted, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his face drenched in sweat. Panic erupted in the bus. Passengers screamed as the bus began to swerve uncontrollably, veering from one side of the road to the other, the wheels skidding dangerously. Aunt Rose held her children close, her lips moving in silent prayer, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Ahead, a tanker truck loomed, its massive size filling the road like a wall. The driver struggled to control the bus, but it was no use. The bus raced toward the tanker, the sound of screeching tires and terrified screams filling the air. In those moments, time seemed to slow. Aunt Rose's voice rose above the chaos, crying out, "Lord, save us!" Crying out, "Lord, save us!" And then, with a deafening crash, the bus collided with the tanker. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the world went silent. Far away in the village, the wind carried the news of the accident, whispering it into waiting ears. But what no one knew yet was who had survived. News of the accident traveled fast, like wildfire blown by the wind. It reached Uncle James's village before the sun set. People gathered in small groups, murmuring and shaking their heads. "Did you hear? James and his family were in a terrible accident." "Mama," Amaka heard the news too. She fell to the ground, wailing loudly, her wrapper flying as she beat her chest. "Oh, my son, my stepchildren, what have we done to deserve this?" she cried, her voice rising for all to hear. But deep inside her, A wicked joy danced. She thought her plan had worked. Now, no one will come and overshadow my sons, she told herself. Her tears nothing but a mask. At the crash site, help finally arrived. Among the wreckage, Aunt Rose and her children were found, shaken but untouched. Not a single bruise or scratch marked their skin. It was as if an invisible hand had shielded them from harm. Uncle James, however, was not so lucky. He had been sitting in the front seat, and the force of the collision had crushed his legs, He was alive, but his legs were gone. The rescuers rushed him to the hospital, his family following close behind, their hearts heavy but grateful he was still breathing. At the hospital, Aunt Rose knelt beside her husband's bed. Her children huddled around her. She prayed with tears streaming down her face. Lord, you saved us from the accident. Please don't take my husband. Let him live. Uncle James's injuries were severe, and the doctors worked through the night to save him. By morning he was awake, weak but alive. The news of his survival spread, and Aunt Rose's heart swelled with gratitude. Late that day, the old woman Uncle James had helped days before walked into the hospital room. Her steps were slow, but her presence was strong. She stood by his bedside, her eyes full of knowing. "Do you remember me?" she asked. Uncle James nodded weakly. "Yes, Mama." The old woman sat down and began to speak. "I told you not to go to the village this Christmas. I warned you to pray and fast, but you did not listen." She shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "If not for your wife's prayers, you and your children would be gone by now." Uncle James's eyes filled with tears. He looked at Aunt Rose, who stood silently, her hands clasped together. The old woman continued, "Your stepmother, Mama Amaka, and the village witches planned this evil. They cursed you. But God is greater than their plans. It was your wife's prayers that built a shield around your family." Uncle James broke down, his tears flowing freely. "I was foolish," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't listen. I didn't pray." The old woman placed her hand on his shoulder. "Let this be a lesson. Never underestimate the power of prayer. Never ignore the warnings of God." From that day, Uncle James changed. Once he was discharged from the hospital, he became a new man. Every morning, he was the first to call his family for prayers, kneeling beside Aunt Rose and thanking God for his mercy. On Sundays, he was always the first in church, his voice the loudest during worship. As for the village, Uncle James never returned for Christmas again. The memory of what had happened and the knowledge of his stepmother's betrayal kept him away. It wasn't until years later, after Mama Amaka passed away, that he visited the village again, this time with a humble heart and a grateful spirit. The story of Uncle James teaches us a powerful lesson. Never underestimate the power of prayer and always be vigilant, for not everyone rejoices in your success. The unseen battles of life are real, and sometimes danger comes from where we least expect it. But faith, humility, and seeking divine protection can shield us from harm. Thank you for watching this story. If you found it meaningful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more captivating and eye-opening tales on this channel. You are trapped in a room with no doors. No matter how hard you try, you can't escape. Sounds scary, right? But what if the door was never locked? What if the door was never locked? Idris felt trapped in a habit he hated. He masturbated every single day. He tried everything to break free, But nothing worked. The weight of his struggle pressed on his chest like an invisible burden, until one day an old village elder gave him a task so strange, so risky, that if he failed, the consequences would change his life forever. But here's the twist. Was the danger even real? Or was it all a trick? What happened next will leave you shocked. Easy's hands were trembling. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the walls of his small, lonely apartment. The dim glow of a flickering candle cast long, eerie shadows across the room. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but from the same sickening guilt that had tormented him for years. He was trapped in a habit he despised. It started like a harmless escape, a way to silence the loneliness, the stress, the frustration. But now it felt like he was locked inside a room with no doors. Every time he tried to break free, he found himself back in the same dark cycle. The ticking of the old wall clock echoed in his ears, a cruel reminder of time wasted. He had read books, watched motivational videos, even prayed. Nothing worked. Idris buried his face in his hands. Was this how he was meant to live? The thought gnawed at him like a relentless parasite, feeding on his despair. But then he remembered something an old friend once told him about, an old wise man who lived in a distant village. They called him Baba Dyke, a man known for giving strange advice that always worked in the end. Desperate, Ease packed a small bag and set off on a journey to find him. The wind howled through the night as he stepped outside, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. What he didn't know was that this journey would change his life forever. Idris arrived at the village after a long, tiring journey. His feet ached from walking, and his clothes were damp with sweat. He asked around until he found Baba Dyke's house, a small hut at the edge of a quiet forest. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, and the distant sound of crickets filled the night. The old man was sitting outside, carving a piece of wood with a small knife. His hands, though wrinkled with age, moved with precision and purpose. He barely looked up when Ease greeted him. "Why have you come?" Baba Dyke asked without turning. Ease hesitated, then sighed, shifting uneasily on his tired legs. "Baba, I have a problem." "We all do." "No, Baba. This one is different. I have a habit. A bad one. I masturbate every single day. I've tried to stop, but nothing works. It's ruining my life." Baba Dyke finally looked up, his eyes deep and knowing, as if he could see into Idris's very soul. "And this habit," he said slowly, "it gives you pleasure, doesn't it?" Idris swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, but only for a moment. Afterward, I feel empty, ashamed. It's like I lose a piece of myself every time." The old man nodded, as if he had heard this 1,000 times before. He put down the knife and motioned for Idris to sit on a low wooden stool beside him. "Let me tell you a story," Baba Dyke said, his voice carrying the weight of many years. "There was a man who traveled from place to place. He had been walking for many days, and his legs felt heavy like stones. The hot sun burned his skin, and sweat dripped from his forehead. His throat was as dry as the desert sand, and worst of all, his food was almost gone. His stomach growled so loudly it sounded like a wild animal trapped inside him. Then, As he struggled to take another step, his tired eyes spotted something far away. At first, it looked like a shadow, maybe a trick played by the heat, but as he got closer, he saw it clearly. It was an old, lonely house, standing in the middle of nowhere. The windows were cracked and the walls were covered in vines, as if time itself had forgotten it. His heart leaped with hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was food inside. Excitement filled his tired body, and he forced himself to move faster. His weak legs carried him to the house, and when he reached it, he grabbed the door handle with shaky hands. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, as if it hadn't been opened for years. Dust floated in the air, making him cough. Inside, the house was quiet and empty. Broken furniture lay around, and spider webs stretched across the ceiling. The air smelled old, like forgotten memories. Then he saw it. A table stood in the middle of the room, covered in dust, and on that table sat a single loaf of bread. His mouth watered instantly. His empty stomach screamed for it. Without thinking, he rushed forward, grabbed the bread with both hands, and tore off a big piece with his teeth. But the moment he bit down, he froze. Something was wrong. The bread was dry, hard. It crumbled in his mouth like sand. It had no taste, no warmth, no softness. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't delicious. It was old and stale, as if it had been sitting there for years. He forced himself to chew and swallow, but the rough texture scraped his throat. Each bite felt like a punishment, a cruel joke played by fate. His stomach wasn't empty anymore, but he didn't feel happy. He didn't feel satisfied. The hunger was still there, deep inside him. As he looked at the half-eaten loaf in his hands, a thought came to his mind. What if I had waited a little longer? What if I had kept walking just a bit more? Maybe I would have found a village, a warm meal, something better than this dry, tasteless bread. But I was too impatient. I grabbed the first thing I saw, and now I'm stuck with this. Idris frowned. Baba, I don't understand. What does this story have to do with me? His voice was filled with frustration, his brow furrowed in confusion. Baba Dyke smiled, the wrinkles on his face deepening with wisdom. Ah, young man, you will understand in time. But first I have a task for you. Ease leaned forward, his curiosity mixed with apprehension. Baba Dyke stared at Ease for a long moment before speaking, the flickering lantern casting shifting shadows across his weathered face. Idris, he said slowly, what I am about to ask you to do, you must do it. You have no choice. If you fail, there will be consequences. As his heart pounded, his palms growing damp. Consequences, consequences, he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man nodded solemnly. Yes, if you do not complete this task, something very strange will happen to you. As he swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. What will happen? Baba Dyke sighed, his gaze distant as if recalling past failures. I will not tell you, but know this, many who failed this task before you never remained the same. A chill ran down Ease's spine. He didn't know whether to be scared or curious. Now listen carefully, Baba Dyke continued. For the next 7 days, every time you feel the urge to return to your habit, you must do something else instead, but not just anything. You must find something that challenges you, something that takes effort, something that feels difficult but meaningful. And remember, if you fail to do this, the consequence will come. Ez's throat felt dry, his mind racing with doubt. But, but what if I can't resist the urge? What if I slip? Baba Dyke leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes dark with mystery. Then you will see, he said, as he left the village with a strange feeling in his chest. The trees whispered in the wind as he walked away, the old man's words echoing in his mind. Was Baba Dyke serious? What kind of consequence was he talking about? That night, when the familiar urge crept in, he panicked. The silence in his small apartment felt suffocating. Would something bad happen if he gave in? He wasn't sure, but he didn't want to find out. So, he forced himself to do something else. He went outside, took a long walk under the dim glow of the street lights, and started a conversation with an old neighbor he had never spoken to before. The next day, when the urge returned, he did push-ups until he was too tired to think, sweat dripping from his forehead as he gasped for breath. On the third day, he felt bored and restless. Normally, he would have returned to his habit without thinking, but fear gripped him. What if Baba Dyke was right? So he picked up a book instead, flipping through the pages under the soft glow of his bedside lamp. By the fifth day, something strange happened. He realized he was no longer doing the task out of fear of the consequence. He was doing it because he felt better. The fog in his mind seemed to lift, and he could think more clearly. For the first time in years, his mind felt clearer, stronger. By the seventh day, the fear had faded completely, and that was when he understood. And the truth, the mind's illusion. Easy returned to the village, ready to face Baba Dyke. The journey back felt different. The sky seemed brighter, the air fresher. I did the task, he said, his voice steady. The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. Good, and tell me, what was the consequence? Ease hesitated, searching for an answer. Nothing. Nothing happened. Baba Dyke nodded knowingly. Exactly. The consequence was never real. Ease's eyes widened, a wave of realization crashing over him. What? The old man chuckled, his laughter deep and warm. Ease. The human mind is strange. It does not always listen to reason, but it listens to fear. Sometimes we need to trick it into doing what is best for us. Eze felt a wave of realization wash over him, his heartbeat steadying. So, you lied to me. Baba Dyke shook his head gently. I gave you a choice. You could have ignored the task, but fear made you obey. And in doing so, you broke free. Eze sat down, his thoughts racing. He thought about the story Baba Dyke had told him before. The story of the hungry traveler. The traveler had eaten stale bread because he believed he had no other option. But if he had no other option, but if he had waited, he would have found a real meal. Eze had been the same. He had believed he had no control, that he was trapped. But the moment he thought there was a consequence, he proved that he could resist. The power had always been his. The final lesson, the key, was always in his hands. Eze looked up at Baba Dyke, his voice filled with gratitude. You tricked me into proving I was stronger than my addiction. The old man nodded, his expression wise and proud. Yes, because sometimes the only way to escape a prison is to realize the door was never locked. E smiled, a newfound confidence lighting up his face. He had been afraid of losing something, but now he realized he had gained everything. And just like that, he was free. The story of Ezzy teaches us a powerful lesson. Often, the greatest barriers in life are the ones we create in our own minds. Fear can trap us, making us believe we have no control, but the truth is, we hold the key to our own freedom. Change begins the moment we realize that the door was never locked. Thank you for watching my channel. Don't forget to check out more exciting and insightful videos that will challenge your perspective and inspire growth. With a voice like silk and venom, Queen Lami commanded the mirror to reveal the truth she sought. The dim glow of torches flickered against the ornate chamber walls, casting eerie shadows as she spoke. "Show me those who dare to challenge my supremacy," she hissed, her long nails drumming impatiently against the gilded frame of the mirror. The warriors of Akime dared not venture into their land, as stories had it that the giant, once upon a time, in the mystical kingdom of Akime, shrouded in fear and darkness, there reigned the female king of unparalleled power and dread. She was known as King Lami, a name that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest souls. King Lami held the entire village under her oppressive thumb, ruling with an iron fist and a heart of darkness. The scent of incense and burning herbs often lingered in the air, masking the underlying aura of dread. For years, she had sat upon her throne, her dominion unchallenged, her cruelty unmatched. No one dared to question her authority, for the punishment was swift and merciless. Stories had it that she ascended the throne through treachery and sorcery and had since maintained her dominance through a gruesome ritual that imbued her with unimaginable powers. It was said that Queen Lami derived her powers from the most horrifying of sources, the severed manhoods of those who dared to defy her. Legend whispered of dark rituals performed under the pale light of the full moon, where she consumed the essence of her victims to fill her insatiable thirst for power. The very ground beneath the palace was rumored to be soaked with the blood of countless fallen men, their spirits forever trapped within its cursed walls. You may want to ask, are there men in the kingdom of Akime? No free man lives in Akime. The king's warriors roamed the lands and forests like wolves in search of men, capturing any unfortunate soul who crossed their path. These men were then forced into a life of servitude, their bodies used as vessels for the queen's twisted desires. Their ultimate task was to impregnate the women of Akime, for Queen Lami held a deep-seated hatred for the male gender. And so, the men were sent out like pawns on a massive chessboard, their every move dictated by the whims of their merciless ruler. The echoes of their sorrowful cries sometimes reached the heavens, but mercy was never granted. But the horror did not end there. For when a woman became pregnant, she was taken to the queen's palace, where she would be kept under close surveillance until she gave birth. If the child born was a girl, she would be permitted to leave and eventually join the ranks of Akime's oppressed society. But if fate decreed that a male child enter the world, the queen's decree was swift and merciless. For in her twisted mind, she saw male children as threats to her power and symbols of rebellion. Thus, any woman who bore a son faced a cruel fate. Her child would be ripped from her arms and eliminated. The wails of grieving mothers echoed through the halls of the palace, a mournful melody that never ceased. In the depths of her opulent palace, Queen Lami stood before the ancient mirror that held the key to her dominion. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of enchanted candles, their flames dancing like spirits in the